It's been a real pleasure to be at each of these and to watch the growth and evolution of what the Precourt Institute has done with this conference. 10 years ago, there are probably two things that if somebody had asked me, what do you not expect to happen in the next decade? One would be that the U.S. would be within shouting distance, a single-digit percentage of its all-time high in oil production in the year 2015, maybe even exceeding the all-time high by the end of this year, even with a price decline that we've had. And the other is the opening up and change of model in Mexico's energy policy and energy strategy. What we've just heard is just exactly that, and both of those are really the surprises of this decade for me personally. I think it's a marvelous occurrence, and as we heard, even those who designed the change were pleasantly surprised by the embracing of it legislatively.
That's right.
So in that context, we're going to look to use the next 35 or so minutes to develop a little more about what's happening and what it means. And to do that, we're going to build into the time a Q&A period toward the end. But to start, I'd like to ask Jesus Serrano Landeros to give us a little bit of his perspective on the regulatory approach and the regulatory philosophy involved with implementing what you've just heard. And then I'm going to ask Duncan Wood to give his perspective from his Hoover perspective on what's happening and what it means.
You mean Wilson?
Excuse me.
Wilson Center, not Hoover.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes. Jesus?
Yes, I think the first clarification is to say that it's not upstream, but the thing is, in general terms, the idea of the reform was to undertake a very efficient and economic objective, that is to get lower prices. Electricity was very expensive in Mexico, is expensive in Mexico. Industrial tariffs are 80% larger than in US, and that harms competitiveness. And we were, as Guillermo just mentioned, we were on a path of being a net importer of oil products. We were exporting crude oil and importing gasoline, and the net position was almost flat. And we were on the trend of being a net importer. So the approach for the design of the reform and now the regulation is like a textbook model. So we, in both, in the oil sector, oil and gas sector, and electricity, there are several principles that we are following. The first one is not to reinvent the wheel. So these reforms have been done all over the world, so we are trying to take the best practices all over. And a second principle is to work with the markets, along with the markets, and get prices, tariffs lowered by competition and by efficiency. And in this regard, of working with markets, there are some markets that tend to be natural monopolies, like transmission and electricity, like pipelines in some parts of in some regions. So in that regard, the regulation has to be almost non-existent where you have competition or potential competition, and just to guarantee free entry, free access to those segments. And in those segments that you have that tend to be natural monopolies, then you have to guarantee free access and regulated tariffs to mitigate the problems of monopolistic behavior. By the same token, the two monopolies we had, one in electricity, that was the Federal Commission of Electricity, and the other that was Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex, are now changed their nature. They are no longer government entities, that they have a mixed mandate of carrying out public policy. For example, the Electricity Commission had a mandate to electrify the country, to take electricity to the whole country, and they did a good job there. And 98% of the population has electricity in Mexico. And they also had to work as companies. And there was a mix of mandate. In this new setup, these two companies, or these two entities, become productive enterprises, state productive enterprises, and now they have a mandate for creating value, and they have modern corporate governance. For example, in Pemex, you have 5 independent board members. So it's now they have a clear, efficient, productive value creation mandate that will change their orientation, the way they work. And this is important. It's a matter of incentives. There are no bad engineers, evil engineers, and angel engineers, or whatever. It's a matter of incentives. It's a matter of the mandate they have. And now they have a clear mandate to behave as value creation entities, and they will compete in the same terms of the private companies. There is going to be a leveling play field. And in that regard, in those areas, let's think in the case of pipelines for natural gas. In that case, these state entities will not own the assets of the pipelines. They are going to be anchored for some projects, but by reserving capacity, not for owning the assets or providing service. And the idea there is to guarantee free access, and in a similar fashion that we have in electricity markets of independent system operators, there will be an independent operator of the pipeline systems to guarantee this free access. I think this is a point well to mention that the reform in Mexico is an economic reform oriented in the oil and gas industry to get the most out of the value of the oil and gas that is underlying our soil, underground. And in electricity, it's a very concrete and a specific objective of reducing tariffs, reducing the cost of supply of energy to make competitive our industry. And this is, from the broader perspective, this is very good for the area, for the NAFTA region. Why? Because Mexico is one of the main suppliers for the US. 15% of the US imports are coming from Mexico. And there is a lot of integration of the industry in the region. Just to give an example, in order to apply the benefits of the NAFTA in the automotive industry, in the car industry, you require 65% of regional content in cars. And this is done every car that is exported, and millions of cars are exported every day, well, every year, from Mexico and from Canada to the US. So there is a lot of integration. Reducing costs in Mexico will also have an impact on the prices that the US companies are buying from parts from Mexico. And in terms of the energy security and the exploitation of these natural resources, there is a natural advantage for U.S. companies to participate in Mexico, particularly in the shale oil and gas. The geology is very similar, and several studies have concluded that the geology of the reserves in Mexico are similar to that is already operating commercially in the U.S. So in that regard, in the next rounds, where other unconventional resources are going to be tendered, U.S. companies will have this advantage, a natural advantage, and besides the NAFTA has built the whole infrastructure for interaction between U.S., Mexico, and Canada. We already have 20 years exchanging views, exchanging ways to solve disputes, to write contracts, etc. So we have very similar cultures, and this is going to add a new opportunity, a chapter from which Mexico was out because the constitutional restrictions that do not exist anymore.
I have some more questions for you on that in a little while. Duncan, my apologies. Woodrow Wilson, International Center for Scholars.
Both great figures.
Would you give us a little bit of your perspective and how it's been developed as an observer of what's going on? And then I'd like you to put any questions you have to each of our speakers from that perspective.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize how game-changing, what a paradigm shift we've actually seen in Mexico. I mean, if we were to go back 5 years, go back 10 years, 15 years, and you said we would get to where we are today, people would say you're absolutely crazy. Even 2.5 years ago, when I, in my naive, young English boy way, was saying, this is possible, I think it can actually happen, the government seems to have a good plan, a lot of older, wiser heads said to me, you're crazy, you really don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, you've lived in Mexico a long time, but you don't understand the way that we think. And then, sure enough, it happens. I mean, this is a fundamental, really, really critical change that's happened here. And it's extraordinary to understand how that took place. And in the panel we're going to have tomorrow on public perceptions, we're going to go into that a little bit more. Guillermo talked a lot about the problem that existed, both with Pemex and in terms of production overall and government revenues. And he also talked about the opportunity that's there. And that's something that's very, very important. When you think about the possibility of adding another couple of million barrels a day of production in Mexico, maybe that's not so important when you add up all of the production in North America. But as a crucial component of making North America energy independent, it really does play a crucial role. What I would like to focus on, though, in the time that I have, is the process that led to this and the process which is ongoing. Because we can talk a lot about the regulations, we can talk about the timelines, what actually is happening in terms of the legislation. But I think that from a political science and public policy point of view, the process that's been underway has been fascinating. And the first one is what Guillermo mentioned earlier on, which was that the Mexican Congress actually delivered on this. And they didn't just deliver the package that the Mexican government wanted, they delivered a much better package. And that was as a direct result of the democratic process. The Mexican government, with all due respect, put forward a very disappointing proposal in August of 2013. One that the world looked at and said, yeah, but probably not. And then throughout the next few months, we saw a democratic process underway where the opposition party, the PAN from the center-right, actually applied a lot of pressure to the government and said, if you want our votes, the votes that you're going to need to get the 2/3 majority in both chambers of Congress, you're going to have to make this a much more ambitious proposal. So when that legislation was passed, literally I sat there, I was in Mexico City on that day, and I thought, what the hell just happened? It was so much more ambitious than what had been put forward. So it was an extraordinary moment. The policy process, however, is not just about what happened in Congress. What we've seen since then in terms of the interaction with the private sector, with international firms, that's been an amazing process to watch as well. The government has put forward proposals. The industry has said, we like it, but it's not perfect. Let's see if we can make some adjustments. So over the next year, after that constitutional reform was passed in December of 2013, over the next year, we saw the formation of secondary legislation, which really is of world quality. I mean, it's terrific secondary legislation. And so everything was going really well. And then in December of last year, the Mexican government released its contract terms for the first round of bidding. And the industry said, you know, we think you kind of missed the mark here. We know where you're trying to get to, but this isn't going to work. And the Mexican government responded admirably. They said, this is the beginning of a conversation. This is what we think is the right way to go. We'd like to hear your points of view. And through official and unofficial channels, formal, informal channels, there's been a conversation that's been underway. And we're seeing the adjustment process which is happening in those contract terms. And we're getting there. We're not there yet, but we're getting there so that this first round of contracts is really beginning to take off. Guillermo showed you the number of companies that have actually officially registered to make bids. That's very, very encouraging. Just a few weeks ago, we were only at 7 companies, and now we've got a lot more companies that are actually involved in the process. And that policy process, that openness to interaction with the private sector is something which I see as very, very encouraging in the road ahead. And lastly, I think we ought to talk about the challenge that's there. And this is where my questions come in, I think, for the other panelists. You know, it's all been great so far. We've done a fantastic job. But at every stage of the way, we've said, congratulations, now the hard work really begins. We did that after the constitutional reform, we did it after the secondary legislation, and once we get the contract terms in place, we're going to say it again. And the challenge that remains, I guess we have to divide it into 2 areas. We can divide it into lots of different categories, but I would say onshore and offshore. When you're talking about offshore, there's a certain set of challenges there which are to do with the supply chain, which are to do with getting obviously the regulation and the regulatory environment, the regulators and their capacity, all of that stuff. Then you come onshore. And onshore is a completely different kettle of fish. When we talk about the shale reserves across Mexico, we're going to have to, and when we talk about onshore production, you've got to deal with local authorities, local communities, organized crime, rule of law issues. These are huge issues which Mexico is struggling with. Mexico has been struggling with these for a long time and is making progress, but there are significant barriers. And I think it's important to stop and say, we've done a fabulous job so far. This is a game-changing reform, but there's still a lot of work to do. And the good thing is that they're open, I think, to this interaction with the private sector, with civil society, with academic institutions. And I would say just the mere fact that we now have the language of international best practices, that's a huge step in the right direction.
You know, I agree with that. And listening to what's just been said, I reflect back on the experience I had within my firm a decade plus ago when we were an advisor to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on its gas initiative. And that was, it came out of a Tea Party event that was held in Washington, where the Saudis said, we're ready to open up in this area. And for a while, it looked like it was really gaining traction, but the obstacle was the buy-in, the acceptance, the interaction with the national oil company did cause it ultimately to go off the tracks. Mm-hmm. So that's the natural question that came up to me is, how much will Pemex, as an entrenched national oil company in its history, ultimately block this or whatever? And yet what I hear, because of the very term you use, international best practices and the embracing of cooperative work between the companies and the national company, and now it's no longer thought of as a national company, I find myself more optimistic, but I think it's one of the big hurdles to be overcome in the outside perception. Yes?
I would like to comment on something Duncan said, and then try to answer the question. But right. The first thing is that the process was very interesting, as he said. And we as government started trying to do a reform that was acceptable for all of the Congress. No, for the left, for the right, and for the center. Bring them together. Bring them together. So we went and took this, decided to put the profit-sharing contracts in the table. It was nice because you could pay with oil, monetized oil, but nobody would touch the oil with their hands.
Finesse that national ownership issue.
And that was something that protected. We thought that the more liberal or more reform, proactive left wing would go with us. But once we presented the reform, the left wing went to the streets and said, we won't go, no? And I think that there was, as Duncan said, a very important participation of the right wing, but there was also the intelligence in the government to say, we have to go this way. Because if we would go to the constituency of the center, maybe none of this reform would have gone that far. So there was this party that said, well, we want this international practice. And we said, that's what we want, no? So push us, no? And that was the whole process as a whole, no? And regarding the onshore thing, you know that the reform in Mexico included a chapter trying to deal with land ownership. In Mexico, we don't own, as in the States, the subsoil, no? In Mexico, the people own the surface, but the subsoil, as I said, is for the state. No?
Much more typical around the world than in the U.S.
So what we try to do is to put in some incentives for the landowners to participate in the projects and to try to find out if there is a potential in their lands and to come into the government and show us what the potential could be. So, for instance, we opened the superficial studies market in Mexico. Any company can do a seismic study anywhere in the country. You just get a permit, the CNH will give it to you in no time. And that way you can nominate areas to us and we could say, well, this area is very interesting because there is this potential and we can launch it in round 2. So the landowners can do these studies. And on the negotiation between the landowners and the companies, in Mexico there has been a tradition in which Pemex imposed their will to the landowners, and that was not very nice. No? And so the law provides for you to do a public consultation, to do a social study, and once you are awarded a contract, you have to do a real social assessment on how you will work with the community and get the social permit, because we can do a lot of things, giving the governmental permitting and awarding the contract, but if there is no social license, you can do nothing. Yeah. So the law provides for a methodology in which the parts agree upon what should be paid. If they don't agree, we enter as an arbiter, and we offer to do some payments taking into consideration the production if you are in a commercial stage. So you can have like 2% of production as a payment to the landowner. That
sort of landowner royalty in effect.
Like a landowner royalty. So that gives an incentive to the landowners, to the communal property that we have in Mexico, to agree with the company and to get a nice return. Thank you.
Making them a stakeholder, a big deal.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, one of the issues here is dealing with the landowners, which is going to be tricky, and there's all different kinds of landowners in Mexico. You've got the big rancheros, you've got the ejidos, commonly held land, and then you've also got the issue of the local authorities, I think. This is one of the areas where, you know, in Mexico over the last 30 years or so, we've seen enormous advances at the federal level. In some state-level governments, we've seen some good advances, although it's far from being uniform across the country. But the big problem, I would say, in terms of governance in Mexico still remains at that local level. And as people who have operated in the Eagle Ford will know, having reliable partners at the local level, local mayors, local authorities who are willing to work with you in questions of infrastructure, of dealing with the local community, etc., that's going to be crucial. And, you know, in Mexico, I see that as being one of the biggest challenges about operating onshore, is you're going to have to deal with local mayors who are often far from being professional. We still have a problem of a deep level of infiltration of organized crime into local authorities in Mexico. And this is where, again, I think you have to see that the private sector is going to have to work alongside the Mexican government to try to strengthen communities, to build them up into being much more resilient to the influence of organized crime. And the Mexican government really has to do its job in terms of strengthening standards And that's one of the things that with the government is trying to do. But ironically, in this case, the democratic process is kind of playing against that in some of the president's latest proposals to deal with corruption, transparency, conflict of interest, and infiltration by organized crime.
I agree with you on that, and I think that is a real obstacle in the minds of people who'd be otherwise very interested in the Eagle Ford. It's very clear that the Eagle Ford probably extends well along that coastline, and we have to remember that the Eagle Ford in 3.5 years has gone from a standing start to 1.5 million barrels a day in the U.S. So there's a big prize there if you can crack it. It seems to me what I just heard from Guillermo about the idea of how do we create a stakeholder mindset among the surface owners is a step in that direction. I especially like as well that idea that parties can initiate to nominations, get a license to do seismic, initiate a nomination, because what I think the way to get to that is to find some world-class case studies where a success is achieved, and then others begin to say, I want to buy into that. Mm-hmm. But that issue of crime, corruption, security is a big hurdle in the early days. So finding the area where perhaps that's a more manageable task to take on, and to do it with that stakeholder provision that you have, and with that, let's initiate the bottom-up process. And the very process you talk about of how interactive this has been so far stands in real contrast to my own personal experience, where a transformation was achieved and went off the rails. So I'm encouraged to hear that.